All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Sarah White. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator at the Northampton County Historical and Genealogical Society, shortened to NCHGS. Our mission is to share the stories of Northampton County's past to encourage personal reflection, community dialogue, and an understanding of history's impact on our lives. It is our vision that through exploring local history, we will foster a more respectful, caring, and inclusive community. The Sigel Museum, where NCHGS is based, is home to a significant collection of pre-European settlement artifacts, curated, loaned, and donated in collaboration with the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania and members of our local communities. Our newest permanent exhibit, Destination Northampton County, tells the stories of those who settled here long ago as well as today. We encourage you to become a member of NCHGS for invitations to opening receptions, free museum admission, and free access to our research library. For more information on our exhibits and our programs, please visit sigelmuseum.org. We will have a question and answer period following the conversation, so please feel free to drop any questions into the chat feature that is at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We will respond to as many as our time allows. Tonight, NCHGS is excited to be in conversation with Dr. Omaris Zamora, Assistant Professor of Latino and Caribbean Studies and Africana Studies at Rutgers University. Dr. Zamora is a transnational Black Dominican Studies scholar and spoken word poet. Her research interests include theorizing AfroLatinidad in the context of race, gender, and sexuality through Afro-Diasporic Approaches. Her current book project, tentatively titled Cigüapa Unbound, Afro-Latina Feminist Epistemologies of Transformation, examines the transnational Black Dominican narratives put forth in the works of Elizabeth Acevedo, Nelly Rosario, Josefina Baez, Cardi B, and many, many others. Dr. Zamora pays close attention to how they embody their Blackness, produce knowledge, and shift the geographies of Black feminism in ways that recognize the legacies of Chicana, Latina, and Black American feminist theory in the United States, but tends to the specific experiences of Afro-Latina women and their multiple genealogies. So let's start today's conversation with some basics. How do you define Afro-Latinidad, and why is it important to distinguish Afro-Latinidad from, for example, a broader framework of Latin American or Latino studies?
Hi, so Sarah, first I want to say thank you so much for the invitation to be here and to be in community and in this conversation. I'm really excited to delve into this conversation with you and with folks who may see it now or may see it later. I think that's a really fantastic question that you asked, because often folks might not even know that Afro-Latinx people exist, right? Afro-Latinos, Afro-Latinas, Afro-Latinx people, right? And the ways that I define who Afro-Latinos are, right, is really very much referring to and using the definition that our late Miriam Jimenez Roman and Juan Flores offer in the Afro-Latino Reader, which is an excellent book, right? It's an anthology made up of the works of Afro-Latinx scholars, folks who study Afro-Latinos, folks who are Afro-Latino, and the definition that they offer really, one, right, kind of centers on that these are Black Afro-descendant people, right, whose families, right, kind of come from Latin America and the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, right, and in particular, one of the layers that is part of the introduction of the book, but that I also always emphasize, is that we're talking about visibly Black people. And when I say visibly Black, I'm referring to street race, which is a sociologist, Nancy Lopez, reminds us of what street race is how, right, we take up space on the street, right, and in these social spaces, right? We know that race is socially constructed, and it has, right, impacted, it has social political implications, right, and very material, right, implications on people's lives. And so it is important to delineate, right, that when we're talking about Afro-Latinos, we're talking about a very particular racialized group of Black people from Latin America and the Caribbean, right? And that's important to say in contrast to, right, a broader Latin American or Latinx identity, which is more an ethnic identity, not a racial identity, right? Is to say that one, there's a diversity of races within the Latinx community and within the Latin American community, right? And Afro-Latinos are part of that, right? Or Afro-Latin Americans, right, are part of that. And it's very important so that we can, one, right, actually see Afro-Latinos, and two, actually pay attention to the experiences and the ways that systemic, right, racism and institutional racism is experienced by Afro-Latinos and Afro-Latin American people. So that is just my long way of saying, right, who are Afro-Latinos and why is this, right, designation important? How is it different to just the broader, right, Latin American or Latinx identity?
Right, and I think it's important too to distinguish that this isn't some kind of just theoretical concept that we talk about from, you know, the comfort of our armchairs in academia, right? It's something that has day-to-day implications. Like it's something that we see in, not we as a white person, visibly white person here, but something that is seen and experienced on a daily basis. So in line with the importance of this distinction, can you elaborate on the priority of situating not only your current book project, but your work in general within a specific Black American Latina feminist approach?
Yeah, definitely, certainly. So I think one of the things that we find is that there is currently, right, an emerging attention to Afro-Latinos, not just in general in the media, but also in scholarship, right? And a lot of the scholarship that we have so far, right, focuses more on issues of history, representation, sociological studies, right? But one of the things where I situate my work is twofold. One is that there wasn't, and it's just now, right? Like folks are actually taking on the projects of thinking about Black Latinx, Black Latina women's experiences, right? And thinking about gender and thinking about sexuality, right? That hasn't necessarily been at the forefront of the scholarship that has been emerging around Afro-Latinos, right? So that's one part, right, in which my scholarship is about if we can think about, and here's the second part, right? If we can think about what Black American feminism is, right, conceptually, and thinking about what Black American feminism has given us, right, and kind of the legacies, right, from the Combahee River Collective, right, Audre Lorde, who's Black Caribbean, right, from Angela Davis, et cetera, and we can also think about the legacies that we have received from Chicana feminists and other Latina feminists that may not be Black, right? Where is the space for understanding and thinking theoretically as well of what is Black Latina feminism then? Right, because we know that the experiences of Black Latinas or Afro-Latinas, and I use those terms interchangeably because to me they mean the same thing. For some folks, we can get into a conversation later about how some folks want to depoliticize or take out Blackness out of Afro-Latinidad, which is a whole other conversation. But right, yes, yes, your facial expressions are like what? Yeah, and so part of it is saying, what are the experiences of Black Latina women and what kinds of knowledge are they creating that they then circulate amongst themselves, right? What is Black Latina feminist theory, right? And so that's where my work is situated, right? It's building on the legacies of Black feminism and Chicana feminism, but it's also saying there's a gap because none of these frameworks at the same time, one, really think about Blackness diasporically, right? And thinking about that there are Afro-Latinas or Black Latinas, right, who have migrated from Latin America and Spanish-speaking Caribbean to the United States, right? Where there are these racial frameworks where Blackness is seen as usually African-American, right? Non-immigrant, unless it's immigrants from the continent, like English speaking, right? And having, you know, these kind of historical roots here, right, in the United States, right, post, right, the enslavement of Africans, right, that were brought to the Americas, particularly the United States, right, where on the other hand, right, we also have that Latinidad, doesn't see and refuses to see, right, Black people, right? Because there is this thing of we're going to racially mix, we're all Latinx, we're all Latino, there's no race here, right? Which is part of the genealogies and the legacies of Latin America and the Caribbean and the Spanish colonization, right? And empire. So often Black Latinas are getting lost, right, in these frameworks that imagine Latinidad this way, that imagine Blackness this way, right? And so we have to kind of integrate, or not integrate, but really say, well, what is the experience of Black Latinos? It's the African diaspora, it's gender, right? It's also migration, right? We're talking about a group of folks who are very transnational. Black Latin American people and Caribbean people are moving from the United States back to the Caribbean and back constantly, right? So there is this kind of transnational perspective that gets lost as well, right? And how Blackness translates across borders, right? And so I think that's really important to my work, but also what I try to kind of bring in, right? And how I situate my work to kind of broaden the conversation, right? And contribute something as well.
Yeah, so I'm feeling all these old sociological studies coming back up out of my brain, and I did not want to get theoretical with this, so I'm sticking away from that. So you describe yourself in your writing and in your profession as a transnational Black Dominican Studies scholar. Tell us now. You had mentioned transnationalism, excuse me, just a little bit ago. Can you tell us how borders, cultural borders, national borders, borders of identity, borders of self play a role in your work?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a fantastic question, because I think one of the things that is important to the work and important to my own experience and self-identity is that I'm a Black Latina Dominicana from the diaspora, right? Like my parents are immigrants, right? They're both Black Dominican immigrants, right? And my mom always made it a point that every year, any chance she could get, she would make sure that we always knew who we were, right? And would always take my brother every single chance to Dominican Republic. It's like, oh, where are you going for winter break? Dominican Republic. Where are you going for spring break? Dominican Republic. Where are you going for the summer? Dominican Republic, right? I lived as a child a very transnational life, right? In some ways, not in the same ways that people, like I wasn't going to school in Dominican Republic, but there was this kind of what Juan Flores would call the kind of coming and going, right? Of the diaspora, right? Almost in the sense as if, right, the cultures from Dominican Republic are always seen in my life here, right? It's part of your household. It's what travels, right? It's part of your community and the people that you relate with and the people you grow up with, right? And so transnationalism, right, in the actual movement geographically, right, really also tells me, right, growing up that I am Dominican, but I'm Dominican American, because every time you go back to Dominican Republic, they'll be sure to remind you, oh, you're a gringa, you're not really from here, until they realize, oh, wait, you don't even speak English that good. You know, as a child, like English was my second language. It was my first language. So like, wait, you don't actually speak English that good, but you were born over there, but you dance bachata really well, like an actual Dominican, right? So then like, there are these ruptures around the essentialisms of identity, especially, right? That it's like, okay, well, to what degree are these national borders really tell us about who we are, right? And in some ways they do, right? Because when we think about like globalized cultures and what TV shows are we watching over here, what TV shows are they watching over there, what kind of music people are listening to, and the ways that music travels, right? It's one of those things that you start to really experience transnationalism in the sense that you're not just moving across borders, but there's cultures moving across borders. There's language that's part of your identity formation. There's community that becomes part of your identity formation, right? That's very transnational. Like so-and-so is going to Dominican Republic. My mom's going with so-and-so, then so-and-so is going to pick you up and bring you over there too, right? There's this kind of networks that are very transnational, right? In the immigrant community as well. And so that becomes part of my identity. It becomes part of my work, but also for me, it was like, well, okay, so how is Blackness transnational here too, right? Because Dominicans are known for being a country of predominantly Black people who may not self-identify as Black, right? And so it's interesting because part of the project of thinking about Dominican Black studies, right? And I'm not the only one who has said this, is that often we're thinking about Blackness in Black Caribbean communities like Dominicans
Mhm.
by studying the ways that Blackness culturally, identity-wise, right, experience-wise, how are folks experiencing Blackness? How are folks enacting Blackness or performing Blackness as Black people, right?
Mhm.
That may not necessarily say I'm Black, but they know they're Black, right? They know in Dominican Republic, folks will know, oh, I can't go to that nightclub because I'm too dark, right? That nightclub is for the light skinned and white Dominicans, right? The elite, right? And so that you have to fit a particular profile no matter how well dressed you are, right? So those are ways that people do talk about Blackness and whiteness in the Dominican culture that might not necessarily come out in different ways. And so there is a transnational that migrates too, right?
Mhm.
Ideas of anti-Blackness, ideas of policing your own Blackness. How do you, make sure that you can fit into whatever, right? The assimilated idea, right? Whether it's straightening your hair or lightening creams, right? Or all these kinds of things that people do, that stuff travels too, right? So when
Mhm.
we're talking about transnationalism, we're not talking about just identities and culture and language. We're also talking about how folks think of themselves racially and how does that translate and transfer as they migrate or move through these borders, right? And it's been a very interesting journey to like see my parents and my siblings navigate those conversations for themselves, right, in the United States, which is very much a part of my work of okay, let's talk about Dominican Blackness, right, in the ways that folks are thinking through and knowing, right? A lot of it is about the knowing more than about the defining, right?
Mhm.
About knowing that you're Black because of how you occupy space, right? What happens when you walk into the room, right? Um, so yeah, I'll pause there because I feel like I can blab on.
Yeah, no, that's so important to talk about too, because I feel like that's just such an inherent trait of the 21st century.
Hmm.
Even like especially in the last 50 years, the movement of peoples just all across the globe has sparked these conversations that maybe before we were having, but just not to an extent. Um,
Hmm.
and it brings, sorry, I'm definitely going off script here a little bit, but it
No,
makes
it's
me
totally
think.
fine.
It calls to mind like the shifting identities and the shifting, I guess, paradigms of identities and how you define home and how you define community. And that's one of the central tenets of one of the exhibits that we have is how do you define community in your particular community and in
Hmm.
the wider community that you're a part of.
Hmm.
And a lot of what we try to emphasize at the museum and our society in general is um, why it is so important for us to reconsider what constitutes history, whose whose stories do we tell, and who has been marginalized, who has been silenced, and whose stories are we not telling, right?
Hmm.
So could you tell us how your work, not only with this project, but with your work in general, how your work contributes to this reimagining of the stories that we tell and whose stories we get to tell and whose stories are not being told?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question and an excellent point that you're making because part of the reason I started this project,
Mhm.
right, was that I felt that growing up, part of my community were really mostly it was a Black Latinx community, a Black Latinx community in particular to like my Dominican inner circle, right, where it was my mom, us, and my mom's friends, and they were all, I mean, even to this day, right, like my mom still has her longtime friends. The Dominican community in Chicago is really small, so a lot of folks know each other.
Mhm.
Um, but I felt as I got older that there was something happening that wasn't being acknowledged, right? And part of the legacies of Black and Latinx feminisms is this idea of theorizing in the flesh, right? This idea that you can really create knowledge from your body, right? From your experiences of being a racialized woman, right? And so what I noticed was that where are the stories of Black Dominican women who are immigrant, who are living in the United States, who are Afro-Latinas, whether they identify that way or not, but we know they are, who is telling their stories, or how is it that the stories that they tell, the knowledge that they share with each other, isn't being documented? One, they're not being recognized as knowledge producers, right? In the ways that we may in the academy of whose book do you read and whose history are you reading, right? There wasn't that, even though there are, right, many Black Dominican writers of creative work, right, of novels and poetry and performance work, right, that is very much a representation of what I witnessed and experienced growing up as a Black Dominicana from here, right, that's very transnational, right? And so I asked myself questions of, one, what is that Afro-Latina feminist knowledge? That, where is it, right? Why is no one recognizing that as knowledge production? The fact that there are these working class Black Dominican women in a basement in Chicago, someone created their own hair salon down there and everybody goes there, and there's stories being shared and there's knowledge being shared, there's advice being shared, right? There's experiences of violence, experiences of joy, experiences of pleasure being shared. There are these intimate spaces of vulnerability. There are these intimate spaces in which people share even, you know, things of their intimate life, or like, let me give you some advice on that, right? Like, there are these spaces, I'm like, this is a space of knowledge production and dissemination. Like, do people not really see what's going on here? Like, this is it right here, right? And so I think that folks, right, we know that especially marginalized communities need to be empowered to tell their own stories, right? But often the spaces, and there are no spaces that are welcoming of such thing. One, they're not seen as knowledge producers because they don't have degrees or because they're not important to a particular group of folks, right? Or in general. And two, right, no one finds it important, right? And so we miss out on so much that we learn, right, from our communities and from marginalized communities, right? That the reality is that if I often see it as a responsibility. And that's how I see this book project, is this is my responsibility and my commitment to my community to make sure that they are seen and that they are known, right? Because I know what I have found is that the experiences that I've had and the community that I come from, right, is very much in conversation with the Dominican diaspora in New York City or the Dominican diaspora in Puerto Rico, right? And that there are folks in these other diasporic communities that are waiting, that need to connect, right? And if my book project can be a way through which different Afro-Latinas in different places throughout the world can see each other, know that we exist, and our narratives, although we may be in geographically different places, are very similar, right? And that you can empower other folks around the world, right? And that folks can really be like, oh, we are important, we are here, I knew that, right? And like, oh, right? And I think there is power in communities telling their own stories, but we have to make space for that. And that's often the challenge, right? Making space for that and also recognizing folks as knowledge producers.
Right, so it's like a lot of us, you know, when we get older and we watch our parents and our grandparents getting older, and we think like, oh, I wish I would have asked more about their time in XYZ. So for you who's watching at home, sit down with your parents and your grandparents. Just go with me on this. Trust me on this one. So talking about your book project. First, let's talk about what is a Cigüapa, right? For those of us who are unaware. Where does this name come from, and why choose this to title your book?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because so it's funny because when I first started this book project as a grad student, it was, you know, based on my dissertation, I wasn't thinking very much about the Cigüapa, even though it would come up every now and then, but I didn't really know what to do with her image or her story, so I kind of ignored it for a very long time. And the way that this came about, so the Cigüapa, and I'm going to share my screen if possible. Yeah. Nope, I can't share my screen. Post to save. Okay. Because I wanted to pull up a image of what a Cigüapa looks like for folks to have an idea. Let's see if I can. Okay, this one's a good one.
Are you able to screen share, or do I need to?
I think I can. It still says host disabled attendee screen sharing. That's okay.
All right, see if that works.
Oh, now yep, it just let me do it now. Okay, great, fantastic. So this is a Cigüapa. This is kind of like a obviously a like artistic image, but the Cigüapa is a kind of how you see here, a nude woman with very long hair, and her feet are facing backwards. I don't know if you can kind of see that here. And it's part of Dominican kind of folk tales, myths, right? Not necessarily real. But people will say like, oh, you just gotta be careful walking through the mountains. You might find a Cigüapa, right? And the Cigüapa story, right, came out in the mid 1800s. It was published by this man named Angulo Guridi, Javier Angulo Guridi, who was a criollo. So his parents were white Spanish people who had come in with years later, right, part of the Spanish Empire. He's born in Dominican Republic to these white Spanish parents. So he's what we call criollo, right? And so he writes a story. The first published story of Cigüapa is a story that says there's this woman, she's kind of an indigenous woman who lives in the mountains and she cannot be trapped. And the only way that you can catch her is when there's a new moon and with a brown 5-fingered dog, right? But the moment that you catch a Cigüapa, she dies because you've captured her, right? She's sad. And the Cigüapas are threatening. There are these evil figures that kind of lure men in with their song, right? They kind of make these bird sounds. They hypnotize them and they basically make them disappear, right? So the Cigüapa is usually portrayed as a beastly, monstrous, scary, and threatening feminine figure, right? And so the way that I came back into into thinking about Cigüapa was that I was really captivated by Firelei Baez, who is an Black Dominican artist. I just want to pull up Firelei's work on Cigüapas because she has a painting series called the Cigüapa series. So she has a series of Cigüapas that she's painted, right? So this one's one of them. Let's see if I can make this image bigger. Okay, so this is one of them, speculative Cigüapas. Oh no, this one's called How to Slip Out of Your Body Quietly from Firelei Baez, right? And that's one of her Cigüapa series. And so in all these Cigüapa series that she has, there are all these kind of, right? There's forestry, there's legs, and there's this kind of femininity, right? Cigüapa Pantera is one of them, right? And how I came into Cigüapa was I wanted to write about Firelei's work, especially after reading some of her interviews around her work and how she was thinking of Cigüapa in a way that was actually empowering, in a way that challenges the person who's viewing the art piece, right? And it connected a lot to the story of Cigüapa. Cigüapa challenges, right, our own framing of colonialism and our own framing of what could be, right? But for Firelei Baez, Cigüapa is seen as an empowering figure, as a divine figure, right? She always refers to Cigüapa in this very positive way, right? And there have been other, Black Dominican women who have reimagined Cigüapa as a superhero and as a Black woman, right? Not an indigenous woman. And so what I found interesting that as I started writing what I thought would be the conclusion of my book, I realized that I needed to go back to really think about why is it that generally speaking, when we think about the myth of the Cigüapa, we imagine, right, it's described and imagined as an indigenous woman who's naked and who's evil. But then these, contemporarily speaking, you have these Black Dominican women and artists, writers reimagining the Cigüapa in this other way with this other narrative. And so I had to sit there and like, what's going on here, right? And so part of the reason why this book is called Cigüapa Unbound is really positioning Cigüapa, one, when you go back to the history right, and the context in which Guridi writes the Cigüapa folktale, right, publishes her story, the interesting thing of what's happening in the Dominican Republic in the mid 1800s into the late 1800s, turn of the 20th century, is there is this preoccupation with how are we going to make sure that Dominican identity is disassociated from Blackness, right? And so Guridi, right, is part actually of a white Dominican elitist group, right, who has political influence, right? And he is known as one of the writers, right, who was like the main person to say, okay, let's create these stories, right? And let's actually understand that what makes Dominican Republic, what makes Dominicans is this kind of racial mixture, but it's a racial mixture that we think about the fact that there's a lot of racially mixed Black people, that we can say that that brownness in someone's skin comes from the indigeneity. And so there was this movement in Dominican Republic where often we talk about racial mixture in Mexico and how mestizaje or racial miscegenation happened, right? But in Dominican Republic, the way that that is happening is through saying, we're going to say that we're a racially mixed nation, that our brownness, which is really the, right, our Blackness actually comes from the indigenous groups that were here. Even though most of the indigenous groups in Hispaniola, you know, through genocide, we're close to non-existent, right, at that point. And so it becomes an erasure of Blackness by using indigeneity as a substitute, right? And so just like Cigüapa and Enriquillo, which is another really big, right, national identity story for Dominican Republic, these characters are made into indigenous people, right? But when really you look at the historical context and you think and you look at what's happening with how race is being handled and how Blackness is being handled, right? There's this kind of anti-Haiti, anti-Black narrative that they're working with to get rid of, right? To kind of get rid of Blackness, right? And so Cigüapa is part of those stories. So then the questions that I come up with is like, well, what does it mean to re-envision Cigüapa as a Black woman in the mountains, very likely based on a maroon Black woman in the mountains, right? And it's not just to say that her indigeneity is non-existent or right, I'm not right, but when we look at the historical context, we understand the ways that indigeneity was actually being used to erase Blackness, right? That the only way that we could say, oh, we're not Black, we're Indian, right? It became the substitute for Blackness, right? So if Cigüapa's indigeneity is a substitute for her Blackness, we can then understand the historical context that Blackness is being erased, not just through discourse and culture, but also through stories and popular culture and folktales like Cigüapa, right? That clearly is found threatening, right? What a coincidence. And so Cigüapa Unbound becomes, right? Because the Cigüapa cannot be bounded. The moment you catch her, she dies, right? And the fact that Cigüapa she's kind of imagined as a superhero by Black Dominican women, I want to imagine Cigüapa as a superhero as well, who has these kind of skills of hypnosis and of creating trance, right? And what does it mean if we actually just pretended for a little bit that Cigüapa is this Black woman who cannot be bounded, who cannot be enclosed, and who has these skills to create enchantments and create chants and create hypnosis and open portals into other worlds, right? Where she's trying to show us something, right? And so part of the book and the grounding and framework of the book is that, right? It's saying, if Cigüapa is trying to teach us something, right? And open the portals into these alternative worlds, right? Of trance, where things, right, where we can see the Black diaspora, where we can see, right, what a decolonial space could look like or can be like can we actually listen to it, right? And so Cigüapa Unbound is why the book is called that, but also thinking from that point of thinking of history and thinking about context and thinking about bringing it back to Firelei's work, right? And also the narratives, right, that I talk about in the book, right, the novels, which are, right, and we know that novels and art are many times a representation of life, right? And so part of the book is that, right, is saying what tools is Cigüapa giving us to allow us to see Afro-Latina feminist thought.
Like, there are so many layers that we could talk about right now, but we'd be here until the morning, right? But just so many different modes that we can take with like identity and crossing uncounted borders right now, right? But one of the questions that I want you to elaborate on a little bit. So the book is Cigüapa Unbound. The second half of the title is Afro-Latina Feminist Epistemologies of Transformation. But importantly here, it's transformation, not TRNAS, but TRANCE. What does this transformation mean in the context of your work, and how can this transformation of self become a method of telling and doing history and uplifting those histories?
Yeah, definitely. So transformation is a word that I play with, right? And as you kind of pick up that there's still the sound of sorry, I just felt like a shake and I was like, is there an earthquake happening? What's going on?
Don't say that.
Hopefully not. I mean, people have been talking about New Jersey shaking, so I don't know. Transformation is a key word, right, to the book because it thinks about, in simple terms, what is trans, right? TRANC, like to be in a trance, right? And it means, right, and I engage it in that way because I want folks to think about how trance is a space, right, in your consciousness, right? It's an alternative space of consciousness between dreaming, between the waking world, that might be induced by the repetition of a rhythm or the repetition of a movement or the visual repetition of something moving in circular forms, right? And this can happen while you're running, right? Or while you're cycling, or while you're at a house music, concert, right? That there's this kind of continuity, right, that happens. This also happens, right, in Afro-Diasporic religions, right, where trance is induced in order to, right, have that moment where ancestral spirits or, right, different loas or entities might enter the body, right, to then, right, convey some kind of message, right? And so when I'm thinking about trance, I'm thinking about trance as a space where one may enter, where no longer the kind of rigidity of identity, where to say like, well, blackness is only Black American, and the gender of woman can only be thought of this way, and sexuality can only be thought of this way, right? These kind of very rigid frames, right? Borders that really run our lives, right, in the material world, right? And so when you enter the space of trance, very often those things that are super definitive and essentialist aren't at the forefront anymore, right? And so trance is what allows us, I argue, to see, right, how to see the African diaspora, right? For Black people across borders and across national spaces to see and recognize each other, right? And that there is that piece of it, and to also understand the transnational rightness of it in ways that center, right, Afro-diasporic thinking beyond borders, right? So to say that you can be a Black person, but that your Blackness isn't defined by your national space. And if we put down that kind of national identity, Black people might be able to actually see each other across these national identities, right? As Black people, and like, oh, I see you and you see me, right? And these other kind of identity markers are no longer relevant to our relating to one another, right? And so thinking also about humanity and humanness, right? And understanding that how could we as Black people see each other and see our humanity, and defining how we define human for ourselves, and not by these kind of white supremacist frameworks that have decided who's human and who's not, right? Or who's more valuable and who's not, right? And so that's what trans does in the work, right? It's transnational, it's Afro-diasporic, and it also conceptually or philosophically challenges us to enter the portal into the trans so that we can, right, see each other, right, and actually think through what kind of knowledge might be in there, right, that we might be missing out on, right? And so the trans isn't forever, right? Just like in the real world, like trans is momentary, right? So even though it's momentary, it may not necessarily be something real, but at the same time, it has a real impact in someone's life, right? And that's something that even folks who do like mental health work will use, right, trans as a tool to help
Right.
some of their patients, right? And often what happens when the patient is in the trance is that the person who may be, right, the doctor or the medical provider might be making some suggestions to kind of help that person heal, right? And even while they're in the trance. And the moment that they're out of the trance, they might be more likely to follow up on some of those suggestions that were made while they were in trance, right? So that's where the transformation happens, right? It's the moment you step out of the trance after being in it, that you've gathered some knowledge that now you may move in the material world with that new knowledge and transform in a very completely different way, right? One of the things that I compare it to in my introduction is to the Matrix, right? Folks who have seen the movie The Matrix know that there's a point in which Neo finds out that he's in the Matrix and how the Matrix works, right? And all of a sudden he learns that, oh, this is what's happening, this is what's actually, and so then he goes to return, right? There's a moment where he kind of returns back, right, into his world, already knowing that knowledge, and then starts to create change, right? And starts to do these other things because now he's coming back into his world, but he's coming back into his world, a particular set of knowledge, right? Where transformation again happens, right? So there's trance, there's what you take from the trance, and then there's transformation, right? Which can happen in the material world, right?
I'm not kidding you guys when I say we could stay here until 9 o'clock at night, but I'm not going to do that. I know we probably all need sleep, right? Just a reminder too, we do have a couple questions left, but if you have any questions for Dr. Zamora, please put them into the chat feature at the bottom. So needless to say, this has not been a project for you that's just, come about in the last couple of months, right? This is an ongoing work.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the journey from like the conception of the project to where you are now? So what has been the most rewarding aspect, some of the challenges that you faced, and just kind of the things that you have learned along the way?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just making notes because I don't want to like, forget to answer any parts of the question. Inception. So I'll start with the inception of the project. So this project really started, I want to say about 10 years ago, maybe even a little more than 10 years ago, but about 10 years ago is when I really sat with and thought about the fact that I felt that there was a gap, that there was a missing link to really understanding my own experiences as someone who was a grad student in Texas, and that every time I would go, and it was something ongoing since I was a child, right? That I would experience, right, anti-Blackness in the Latinx community, that I would experience not always being seen by the African American community. The moment I would tell them I'm Dominican, oh, so you're just Latina, you're Hispanic, you're not African American, you're not Black. And I'm like, and I'd always be kind of confused by it because I didn't know what to say until I got older, and there was, the Afro-Latino reading. I was like, oh, there's language and there's ways of understanding my identity. I didn't know there were words for this, the grammar for this, the vocabulary for this experience. But furthermore, really thinking through how empowering Chicana feminist work, Black feminist work was so impactful for me, right? And my own experiences. But I also still felt there was a lack. I was like, there's something that this doesn't fully capture my experience as an Afro-Latina, right? Like, where is Afro-Latina feminist work? And so I started to look. I was like, okay, who do I read? I started buying some books. There was the Afro-Latina Women Warriors book that's edited by Marta Moreno Vega, which was one of the first works that I read that focused on Afro-Latinas and the empowerment about, like, I was doing all the research because I was like, okay, this is great. The narratives are here, the stories are here, the novels that represent these stories are here. But where's the theory? Like, where's the work that kind of identifies some of the patterns, right? That we can really understand, right? What is it? And there wasn't that. And so I set out to do the research and kind of bring together these novels, right, and performance texts and conversations, revisiting conversations with my family, particularly the women in my family, right, to kind of piece together what is Afro-Latina feminist theory, right? Or what is one way, right? One, because there could be many, right? But what is one way to think about this? And the interesting thing is that as I was doing this work and as I was trying to publish this work, you know, some of the challenges, I will say, was that 10 years ago, nobody was really even, there were people were barely even talking about Afro-Latinos. They definitely weren't talking about Afro-Latinos in the media, in the mainstream media as they are now. They're definitely even in scholarship. It was very small, right? And the challenge is that there's still a lot of anti-Blackness in the Latinx community at large, but also in scholarship. There are folks who don't want to hear it, that there is anti-Blackness in the Latinx community, that there is white supremacy in the Latinx community, right? The same folks, right, who may be white Latinos or light-skinned Latinos, right, and the privileges that they get through that, right, and through those proximities to whiteness, they also enact, right, anti-Blackness. And if you are a racialized person in the United States who may not be Black, but you're a Latino person, and you're also enacting anti-Blackness, and you're also experiencing, right, white supremacy, and you're also experiencing racism, right, in a certain degree, you don't think that you can oppress others often, right? You're not ready to say, oh, I am anti-Black, or I do participate in white supremacy, right? And so it's been a challenge to get folks to understand that the only way we move forward, that the only way that we all get liberation is if we need to also center and address anti-Blackness and be anti-racist, right? And that includes, right, acknowledging that these people, first of all, exist, right? Because that's one is representation and existence, acknowledging the existence of these folks.
Right.
And second of all, listening to these folks and acknowledging that they are knowledge producers. And third, actually saying, okay, you know what, we need to reflect and see how we can become an anti-racist community, right? And so it's been challenging to get folks to understand all of those parts of the work, right? And those challenges can can look like not getting a grant because people don't find the work important, or not getting a fellowship because people don't find it important or a good fit, right? Or not getting a particular position, right? Because people might find it threatening. They're like, ooh, we don't want to talk about racism, right? Or, folks not publishing a piece of article in a scholarship because they feel it's not a fit, or particularly because they don't find the work important, right, or valuable. And so those have been challenges that lately the shift, right, and then the push, right, continuous push, because I never gave up. I was like, no, I got to keep pushing. This work is important, right, and for me, it's not just the work as a scholar, but it's also the work that I do with my community, right, doing, right, book clubs in Manhattan in the Dominican community, doing, right, community organizing, doing events, right, around Afro-Latinidad, events about solidarity between African Americans, Afro-Latinos, and Latinos, right? Like, what does that look like, right? It's how we continue the conversation. And I think the reward is also having people acknowledge the work, having people opening up the conversation where other Afro-Latinos are like, oh, there are spaces for me to also coexist, for me to also be a knowledge producer and contribute to this knowledge creation, right? And actually seeing each other, right? And so I think the biggest reward for me is, and it's the thing that pushes me forward and that keeps me committed to seeing this book out there to the very end, right? Until it's hardcover out and buyable, is that I owe this to my community of Black Dominicanas in Chicago who are from working class poor backgrounds, who continuously show up for each other, right? And these are the kinds of things that I see even in the Dominican community in New York City, right? And in other Dominican communities that I've seen in Spain even, or in Puerto Rico, right? And I owe it to them because that's my community. My community made it possible for me to be here, and their stories must be told. And if not me, then I don't know who. I'm sure maybe there'll be more people. I hope there will be more people, right? But it's like, this is my kind of the fruits of their labor. Like, I'm not the one theorizing this. I'm just saying, oh, look, they're theorizing this. They're doing this theory, like they're doing this thing. I'm just saying that they're doing this thing, but they are doing it, right? They're existing in this book doing that thing. I'm just saying, hey, look, right? And saying there's a pattern here. Here's the theory, right? So those are the inception, those are the challenges, right? And the rewards are like, well, now people are actually talking about Afro-Latinos, even in the mainstream media.
Yeah.
Oh, now people actually in the scholarly world are actually wanting to engage in this conversation. And finally, more folks have understood that this is an important conversation, right? Not just in scholarship, but in how we move through the world, right? And how do we create transformation? How do we become anti-racist communities, and what does that entail, right? And so I'm grateful for the rewards, but that doesn't come without the challenges.
Yeah. So moving into the future, what are your plans for I know I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to say when is the book going to be done, right? It's like when you're still in grad school and your parents are like, so how's the dissertation going? And like, can you please ask me any other question, please? So what are your future plans, either with the book or going forward, or where are we going?
Yeah. So, I'm still working on the book. The full draft is basically almost done, minus the conclusion. But, so I'm hoping it'll be out. I mean, publishing an academic book it just takes time, but my hopes is that it'll be out in the world, by the end of next year, beginning, right, 2024.
Awesome.
It sounds like a long time, y'all, but it really, we all know time flies. And so I think I've been thinking a lot, right, and kind of starting to think about and do some preliminary research for my next project. And I kind of have two projects, kind of maybe three, I don't know. I haven't decided which one really is going to be the next one, but one of them is a collaboration that we're all kind of collectively thinking through, right, to kind of that would be more public humanity, with a more public humanities aim, that kind of maps and creates that like an oral history project of Black Latinos in Puerto Rico in particular, because we often think about Black Puerto Ricans, but we also know that there's a lot of Black Dominicans in Puerto Rico. We also know there are other Black Caribbean people who live in Puerto Rico. And so that's one of the projects that we want to take up, is mapping Black Puerto Rico, right? From with that diasporic lens, right? Acknowledging that there are Black Puerto Ricans here, there are Black Dominicans here, there are other Black Caribbean people who moved to Puerto Rico, right? And how are they making community, right? What are the local Black-owned businesses in Puerto Rico, right? Where did Black history happen in Puerto Rico? That may be Black Dominican, Black Puerto Rican, or other Black Caribbean folks, because the reality is that the Caribbean is trans-Caribbean, right? Black Caribbean people move throughout the Caribbean, and there's a history of that, right? And so that's one of the projects that we're trying to undertake, as well as the other more like the solo author project that I'm currently doing some preliminary research on, is thinking about the Afro-Latinx narratives of post-incarceration. So as a daughter of a Black immigrant Dominican father who was incarcerated for almost 20 years, right? I'm very invested, not just in thinking continuously through Cigüapa Unbound, of if Cigüapa is unbound, she's also, right, abolitionist, right? She's also, right, thinking about prison abolition, but for me, it's the perspective of what happens in the supposed aftermath, right, of incarceration. Because we often think even about post-slavery, right, or the aftermath or afterlives of slavery. And so I'm really interested in thinking about what are the afterlives of Afro-Latinos, Afro-Latinas, Afro-Latinx people that have been incarcerated. What does post-incarceration look like, and what are those narratives, right? And I'm thinking about P.D. Thomas, and I'm thinking about my father, and I'm thinking about Black Artemis, who's Sofia Quintero, Afro-Latina writer, who was writing, right, in the early 2000s, these urban hip hop novels. And one of them is about an Afro-Latina post-incarceration, right? And the kind of, what are those narratives, right? And how do we think about prison abolition, and how do we center Afro-Latinx lives, and how does the conversation continue, right? And so those are some of the projects, right, of what's next. And I'm really excited to kind of jump into that too, because new stuff is always way more exciting than old stuff to me at this point. But that's, that's because Cigüapa Unbound has been a project going on for the last 10 years, right? I'm over it at this point. I am, right? Because I've been spending a lot of time with it, but I'm sure and excited to have it out in the world soon so that other folks may now, right, have a life with it.
Yeah, well, now I'm excited, and this has been so invigorating. Honestly, it's been a really long time since, like, almost since grad school, that I've had the opportunity to sit down and like really talk like migration and identity and stuff.
Yeah.
But there's no way we're ending this conversation like mentioning incarceration and then just ending it, right?
I know.
Could you talk a little bit about your work in poetry and your spoken word poetry? I know we have a little bit of time here if you want to get into that.
Funny story. You're so good at these transitions because I actually wrote a poem that I'm down to share, and I think would be a great way to close because it really captures.
Guys, I swear we did not plan this. Okay.
This is like, I know we did not. Oh my goodness. I'm getting goosebumps. I'm like, the stars are aligning, the energy's right. I wrote a poem after reading Afro-Latina writer Elizabeth Acevedo's Clap When You Land. If you haven't checked out Clap When You Land, I highly recommend it. It's a novel written in verse and reads really quickly, very awesome. And even though the title kind of gives it the sense that you are of when, Dominicans, especially Puerto Ricans too, you land, the flight lands, in Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, people clap, right? Like, oh my God, we made it, right? And so that's why it's called Clap When You Land, right? And part of the story is that what ends up happening is that there is this Dominican father. There was actually, this is real. There was, well, not the narrative isn't real, but the story about the fact that there was a flight of Dominicans going from, I want to say La Guardia to Santo Domingo. This was like a month or a few weeks after the 9/11 incident. So no one paid attention because we were still talking about 9/11, right? This was like a month or a few weeks after the 9/11, and this plane went down, right? It crashed and nobody survived, right? Of Dominicans who left New York City going to Dominican Republic. They did not make it. They did not get to clap when they landed, right? And so in the story, the fiction part of the story is that there was this man on the plane who actually had two families that didn't know about each other. So he had a daughter and a wife in New York City, and he had a daughter and a girlfriend in Dominican Republic. And these two sisters did not know about each other until the plane crash. And so that's how they find out about each other. And even though it's a sad story in many ways, it's also a story about meeting one another, right, and gaining. It's not just losing, but you're gaining. And one of the things about the story that I didn't expect is that it was a story about grief, right? And these two sisters grieving their father, right? And grieving the loss of their father. And at the time that I was reading it, I was on a plane, which you don't want to read anything that has to do with plane crashes while you're on a plane because it'll make you anxious. But at the same time that I was reading this, my father was struggling with COVID. And it wasn't very clear if he was going to make it or not, right? And at the time, him and I weren't talking because he had decided he didn't want to talk to me because he felt that I was too caught up in the wear your mask, but he's a much older man. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to wear my mask while you give me a ride because you're older, you have pre-existing conditions. This wasn't the time where vaccines, existed. So he ended up getting COVID, and I was the person who became the kind of caretaker, calling everyone, calling the doctor, making sure he was, saying things in his ear to kind of keep him motivated, right? I mean, thankfully my dad did make it, but it was very touch and go. And so during this time, I'm reading Clap When You Land, and I'm realizing it's about grieving, right? And I'm in a state where I'm potentially going to grieve my father who may die, right? Who is not talking to me, and who part of the reason why he's not talking to me is because this is his pattern, right? After coming out of prison, where sometimes we're talking to each other and we're in a relationship, and sometimes he decides we're not going to be in a relationship, right? And so I wrote this poem kind of inspired by Clap When You Land and inspired through the moment about capturing how is it that the prison industrial complex continues, right, to affect families and affect folks who have been incarcerated even after they're no longer incarcerated, right? So really about the afterlives of incarceration. So I want to share this poem, and I'll close it off with that because I know we're kind of out of time. Let me look it up real quick. Actually, I have it here. Oh. And this poem is called How to Mourn Your Father Who Is Not Dead. Okay. How do you mourn your father who is not dead? Wait, where'd it go? I just had it in front of me. Here we go. How do you mourn your father who is not dead? It's like an empty kind of grief that holds no deep belly cry. There is no release. Instead, you're angry only half the time. The other half is filled with questionable empathy and compassion because you know that he spent almost 20 years with new Jimmy C. When you were released, I released the resentment that choked me in my sleep onto you. You did the same. Like two people at sea trying to hold on to each other, not to drown, but still drowning. As if both of us now in real life were afraid of the vulnerability, like two cowarding chihuahuas seeing who'd bite first. Dehumanized in a state of exception, in the state of correction, with the department where the lack of communication weighed heavy on a waiting soul, waiting for your letter that always came too late. Dehumanized in a state of exception, in the state of correction, with the department where the lack of communication weighed heavy on a waiting soul, waiting for my letter that always came too late. Too late to my own birth, Christmas gifts that never came, too late to the movie of my living. You got here when the post-production bonusing started, a hint of what had just happened, yet a pending future that you might be a part of. Yet too late to ask forgiveness, too late to give it, too late to give meaning to your name, Papi. Instead, you were B54400, a number, a voice on the other line of the phone waiting for us to accept the call after. This is a call from Denville Correctional Center. To accept, please press 7. A person we drove hours into the cornfields to see after being patted down by the wardens, after they'd make sure our skirts aren't too short, our necklines high enough, our pants not too tight or too baggy, that we look worn from waiting. How do you mourn your father who is not dead, when he is no longer behind bars, but bars are still in between you and me, bars that continuously bring you in and out of my life, figuratively and literally, bars with an afterlife longer than Tupac's thug life, barred from a citizen life, you crossed oceans to see the bright lights. He loves me. Mi hija es la mejor del mundo, de aquí al cielo. He loves me not. Ella se cree que es grande cuando yo soy su papá. He loves me. Ven acá, mi reina bella. Yo estoy tan orgulloso de ti, mi hija, la doctora. He loves me not. Esa se puede meter su diploma por el culo. He loves me. One day we will be together again and nothing will separate us. He loves me not. You are not my daughter. She's dead to me. He writes this as if I were the only one he ever said this to. I yo-yo in and out of loss. If I would have known losing was a record on repeat, I would have been better prepared for the echoes it leaves branded on my stomach. A scar that never seems to heal because it's picked at too soon each time. You dig into it like an unsharpened dagger cutting me open in cold blood. Could you imagine if Lazarus dying and resurrecting over and over again? Mary and Martha probably could have given up after a while. I mourn you in the emptiness of a tomb where a body does not lay, but instead is filled with dreams unfulfilled. I dreamed they'd release you early and that you'd pick me up from school in a limo and we'd have our own Disney happily ever after family story. But we all know those stories are not our stories. How do you mourn your father who is not dead? My belly feels no emptiness. I've always filled it with food to cope with your absence. I learned to love you that way, even though you swore all the gordos should be thrown to the lake and drown. But soon I'd learn to mourn you that way too, and know that I could stay afloat without an anchor. Thank you.
I think we can let that have the last word. There is nothing that I can say that is going to top that right now. Dr. Zamora, it has been a joy and a thrill and a privilege to talk to you tonight. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Please visit sigilmuseum.org. You can see all of our upcoming programs and events. We will have more installments in our In Conversation series coming up. You can find more information about membership, access our online databases, some of our exhibit collections. Yep, I'm just speechless right now and feeling quite a few emotions. So, oh my goodness.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And this was an excellent conversation. I really enjoyed being able to speak with you and be in conversation with you and be able to share my work as well and share some of the poetry that I've been working on. And what a coincidence to be able to end it this way. And of course, please feel free to share any comments or questions or reactions that you are having or that anyone here is having. I know that I'm not sure we have any time for a Q&A or whatnot, but yeah, that's my piece.
Yeah, so we are recording this and it will be up on YouTube. Hopefully by the end of the weekend, we'll have closed captions. Please feel free to drop in anything into the YouTube as well. It's been a joy. It's been a joy. We'll work on all the logistics in the background, but everyone, please have a wonderful night. Enjoy the spring that I know is coming. It's there. I know it's there. But you know, we live in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, so you never know. But thank you to everyone once again, and have a lovely night.
Thank you.